Eleanor knew exactly what you were capable of. Audrey, my adoptive father Richard, stated. His voice echoed with perfect cruelty in the cold attorney's office. She left you the only thing you could manage. I looked down at the paperwork. It was the deed to Birchwood Hollow, a derelict, abandoned timber estate in the Blue Ridge Mountains. This rotting foundation was the sole inheritance left to me by my great-grandmother. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply took the deed and walked out. For 22 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I remembered the Sunday dinners at the Reynolds' Asheville estate like a recurring sentence in a courtroom. It was a grand colonial house, framed by towering white pillars and immaculate razor-sharp hedges. To the outside world, Richard and Clara Reynolds were the epitome of affluent perfection. Inside, every meal felt like standing trial. My place was always the same, seated nearest the swinging kitchen door, acting as the unspoken servant tasked with clearing plates. I sat there in silence while my adoptive mother, Clara, and my golden child sister, Vivian, held court. That particular Sunday, Vivian's designer jewelry caught the light as she preened over her recent corporate promotion. Clara beamed, pouring expensive wine, creating an atmosphere of exclusive celebration that had no room for me. When the conversation momentarily lulled, I quietly mentioned my recent success securing a grant for the regional landscape preservation nonprofit where I worked. The heavy silence that fell over the glass table was immediate and suffocating. Clara didn't even look up from her plate before pivoting the conversation right back to Vivian's stock options. I was instantly erased. People often wonder why someone in my position didn't just walk away sooner. Why tolerate the constant, subtle humiliation? What people fail to understand is the trap of normalized cruelty. When you are raised in an environment of high-status, coercive gaslighting, your brain is actively rewired. Emotional invalidation becomes the atmospheric condition of your life. Clara and Richard didn't use physical violence. They weaponized conditional affection. They trained me to believe that my marginalization was standard, that being treated like a ghost was simply the rent I had to pay to live under their roof. Chronic emotional starvation forces a victim to accept breadcrumbs as a feast. I had internalized their narrative so deeply that I treated their abuse as an ordinary family dynamic. I didn't fight back because I didn't yet know that the cage I was living in had a door. I just swallowed the rejection, cleared the crystal wine glasses from the table, and retreated to the kitchen. I washed the dishes alone, while the muffled sounds of their laughter drifted through the house. It was business as usual in the Reynolds household, but I was done functioning as their emotional liability. The accounting was about to change, and the balance would soon come due. Weeks after Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep, the silence she left behind was deafening. I didn't mourn loudly. Instead, I retreated entirely into my work as an independent landscape architect. The soil, the drafting tables, the silent geometry of nature, these were the only things that made sense to me. My family had moved on instantly, treating her death as nothing more than a legal transition of assets. But late at night, my phone would buzz with calendar reminders, and the memory of Eleanor's gentle, steady voice would flood back. I kept her vintage, silver-engraved pocket watch resting on my nightstand. It was heavy, a tangible anchor to the only woman who had ever truly seen me. Months prior, we had sat together on the sagging front porch of her childhood home at Birchwood Hollow. The mist was rolling thick over the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the damp timber of the estate creaked beneath us. She had held that very watch, her thumb tracing the engraving, before turning her sharp eyes to the rotting wood around us. "This house remembers everything, Audrey," she had whispered, her tone carrying a strange, heavy finality. "There are things hidden here. One day, you'll understand why." I had assumed she was talking about memories, about the ghosts of a family that had long since fractured. I couldn't have been more wrong. Looking back at my own silence during those years, I recognize the invisible chains of the survivor. To the outside observer, my quiet endurance might have looked like weakness or submission, but in a family that actively preys on vulnerability, silence is not surrender. It is a highly calculated survival mechanism. I wore my compliance like psychological armor. If I didn't speak, they couldn't twist my words. If I didn't ask for love, they couldn't weaponize their rejection. I had learned to navigate a hostile environment by making myself as small a target as possible. Enduring their cruelty wasn't a lack of strength. It was an exhausting daily exercise in holding my own pieces together while living in a war zone. Eleanor knew this. She recognized the armor I wore because she had watched the Reynolds family forge it. She knew my independence was a quiet rebellion, a way of building my own foundation far away from their toxic corporate empire. As I stared at her pocket watch ticking softly in the dark of my apartment, the pieces of her cryptic warning began to align. She hadn't left me a worthless property as an insult. She had left me a puzzle, and I was finally ready to solve it. The ticking of the watch was steady, methodical, and completely unbothered by the passage of time. It mirrored the exact mindset I needed to adopt. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon some lingering trace of familial grief, but there was only clarity. I was no longer the frightened girl sitting at the edge of their dining table. I was an architect, and it was time to survey the ruins I had inherited. Defying the mocking text messages from Vivian and the cold dismissal from Richard, I packed my truck and drove out to Birchwood Hollow. The estate was a ghost of its former glory, a decaying silhouette against the rugged backdrop of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The porches sagged dangerously under the weight of choked mountain laurel, and the century-old floorboards groaned like hollow bones. Most people would have seen a financial sinkhole, but as I walked the perimeter, tracing the stone foundation with my hands, I felt an inexplicable magnetic pull. It wasn't a ruin. It was a fortress waiting to be unearthed. I didn't waste time on sentimentality. I immediately hired Caleb Vance, a master historical preservation contractor known for his brutal honesty and unmatched expertise. He arrived before noon, surveying the rotting timber and cracked masonry with a critical eye. After a 3-hour structural inspection, Caleb met me on the overgrown lawn, wiping dust from his hands. His estimate was staggering. It would take over $250,000 just to stabilize the foundational bones of the house. I stood there, calculating the numbers in my head. My entire life savings hovered near $23,000. Fixing this estate would financially obliterate me. It was a terrible investment on paper. Yet, I answered without a single second of hesitation. I told Caleb to assemble his crew. I would fund the restoration by liquidating a massive parcel of my own private design assets. I was willing to bet everything on Eleanor's final wish. I watched Caleb's crew unload their heavy equipment, the roar of generators and the sharp crack of sledgehammers shattering the mountain silence. Every rotten beam we tore out felt like stripping away a layer of the Reynolds family's carefully manufactured lies. They thought I would break under the financial strain, that I would run back to them begging for a bailout. They assumed I was still the fragile girl who needed their permission to exist. But I was an architect. I knew how to rebuild from the dirt up. Almost immediately, the interference began. Richard started calling, leaving voicemails laced with fake paternal concern. "Audrey, you are making a catastrophic financial error." His voice droned through my phone speaker. "That property is a liability. I am willing to buy it off you right now for $20,000. Let me save you from this." Clara followed up with frantic texts, claiming the estate was historically cursed and urging me to sell to them before I went bankrupt. Their sudden, desperate interest was a massive miscalculation on their part. For 22 years, they had ignored my existence and scoffed at my financial independence. Now, they were actively tracking my renovation plans and offering me immediate cash for a house they had literally just called worthless. The math didn't align. Richard's frantic buyout offers only confirmed my deepest suspicions. The property at Birchwood Hollow wasn't a burden at all, it was a vault. And I was going to crack it wide open, no matter what it cost me. The tension at the worksite was palpable by the third afternoon of demolition. Dust coated the air like a thick fog as Caleb and I stood in the main parlor. He was methodically testing the integrity of a massive, load-bearing stone hearth that dominated the center of the room. He struck the masonry with the heavy iron handle of his hammer. The sound was distinct. It echoed solid, then shifted to a deep, resonant hollow, before returning to solid stone. Caleb stopped, shining his heavy flashlight into the dark crevices of the mortar. Someone had constructed a completely false masonry wall directly behind the original fireplace. This wasn't built to support the house, Audrey, Caleb said, his voice dropping low, recognizing the gravity of the discovery. This was built to hide something. Before he could even raise his sledgehammer to break the seal, my phone violently vibrated in my pocket. It was Richard. I stared at the screen, letting the silence stretch before I finally answered. His tone was perfectly calculated, a mix of corporate authority and strained desperation. Audrey, I have been reviewing the market data, he said, speaking far too quickly. I am prepared to offer you $500,000 for Birchwood Hollow. I'll have my lawyers wire a non-refundable deposit to an escrow account today. You just sign the intent to sell and walk away free and clear. I didn't blink. You told me the house was worthless. Richard. I'm trying to be generous, he countered, his breathing uneven. Take the money, Audrey. While he was still speaking, a text message from Clara flashed across my screen. It read, Have you opened the walls yet? Do not touch the internal structure. It is dangerous. Call us immediately. I rubbed my eyes, feeling a profound clinical coldness wash over my entire body. I wasn't experiencing a family dispute. I was negotiating a hostage situation, and the hostage was hidden right in front of me. They were absolutely terrified. The people who had spent my entire life making me feel small were now sweating, scrambling, and offering absurd amounts of money to stop a demolition they had no legal right to control. Your generosity is noted, Richard, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. But the property is not for sale. I hung up the phone and tossed it onto a nearby table. I didn't care about their panic. I didn't care about their sudden willingness to write checks. I turned my attention back to Caleb, who was watching me with a steady, understanding expression. I nodded at the false wall. Tear it down. Caleb swung the sledgehammer. Plaster and stone shattered, crumbling to the floor in a cloud of gray debris. Hidden inside the narrow, dark void between the walls rested a heavy, fireproof iron ledger chest. It was coated in decades of dust and secured with a thick latch. Engraved deeply into the top of the iron lid were two unmistakable letters, E.R. Eleanor Reynolds. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly still, charged with the electric current of a long-buried secret coming to light. I brushed the grit from the engraved initials, feeling the immense weight of Eleanor's foresight. She had known they would try to erase me. She had known Richard and Clara would use every ounce of their corporate leverage to crush my independence. This chest wasn't just a container. It was a carefully laid trap, and my adoptive parents had just walked right into it. A violent thunderstorm was rolling over the Blue Ridge Mountains, lashing rain against the cracked window panes of the parlor as I knelt on the dusty floorboards. With Caleb standing silently as a witness, I forced the rusted latch open and lifted the heavy iron lid of the chest. Inside, protected by thick, waterproof canvas, lay 3 perfectly sealed compartments. My hands were steady. I wasn't afraid of what I would find. I opened the first compartment and pulled out an original, notarized will. It was dated just weeks before her passing, carrying a watertight revocation clause that legally annihilated the fraudulent document Richard's attorney had presented. The second compartment contained a thick, handwritten letter addressed to me. As I read Eleanor's precise, elegant cursive, the true magnitude of my family's depravity was spelled out in black and white. Richard and Clara hadn't just been emotionally abusive. They were calculating thieves. The letter detailed how they had systematically embezzled $1,800,000 from the childhood trust fund established by my biological parents. They had forced me to absorb massive corporate debts from their failing real estate ventures, while secretly funneling my rightful inheritance into Vivian's trust and their own offshore accounts. The third compartment held the final nail in their coffin. Encrypted digital drives containing high-resolution scans of forged signatures, altered bank routing numbers, and a chain of forensic fraud analysis notes written in Eleanor's own hand. The betrayal was absolute, documented with ruthless precision. This was no longer a story of sibling rivalry or parental neglect. It was white-collar criminal fraud on a massive scale. Many people might wonder why Eleanor, a woman of immense power, waited so long to strike. Why didn't she expose them while she was still alive? The answer lies in the silent regret of the gatekeeper. Eleanor understood that exposing a narcissist with partial evidence only allows them to spin a new web of lies. If she had confronted Richard and Clara prematurely, they would have tied the estate up in decades of corporate litigation, using their wealth to bury the truth and destroy me legally. Eleanor sacrificed her own peace in her final years to play a much longer, darker game. She endured their insufferable presence, watching them parade their stolen wealth, all while she meticulously gathered ironclad forensic proof. She didn't want to just scold them. She wanted to mathematically annihilate them. She became the silent architect of their ruin, building a legal guillotine so perfect that when the blade finally fell, there would be no room for appeal. I stared at the bank statements, tracing the forged signatures that had financed Vivian's luxury lifestyle and Clara's designer existence. Anger vanished, replaced by an absolute, terrifying clarity. My entire life of feeling inadequate had been manufactured to keep me compliant while they drained my accounts. This wasn't about seeking an apology anymore. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I carefully packed the documents back into the iron chest, locked the latch, and stood up. The thunderstorm raged outside, but inside, I had never felt more perfectly calm. It was time to execute Eleanor's final design. I picked up my phone and dialed the number Eleanor had provided at the bottom of her letter. I didn't shed a single tear for the family I was about to destroy. They had signed their own warrants the moment they decided my life was a resource for them to exploit. The long era of my silence was officially over. Armed with the iron ledger chest and its irrefutable contents, I immediately retained Julian Thorne. He was a brilliant, retired federal forensic auditor and estate attorney, and, as the documents revealed, my biological grandfather. Julian had been searching for me for decades, his efforts stonewalled by an illegally sealed, closed adoption network that Richard had bribed years ago. When I set the iron chest on his mahogany desk, the reunion wasn't filled with dramatic weeping. It was a tactical briefing between two people who understood exactly how to dismantle a financial empire. The legal takedown was swift, clinical, and utterly devastating. We didn't bother with family meetings or cease and desist letters. We went straight to the federal authorities. For several tense weeks, Julian quietly worked his network of federal prosecutors, presenting Eleanor's ironclad forensic evidence and meticulously mapping the offshore routing numbers. Once the grand jury indictments were sealed, the strike was sudden and merciless. Federal investigators executed emergency warrants, freezing every single asset tied to the Reynolds family. The Grand Asheville estate, the corporate accounts, Vivian's luxury trust. Everything was locked down instantly. The collapse of the House of Reynolds happened in spectacular public fashion. Richard was arrested at his country club. indicted for bank fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. Clara was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The power flip reached its absolute climax in a federal courtroom. Stripped of her stolen wealth and terrified of prison time, Vivian broke down completely on the witness stand. The arrogant golden child wept uncontrollably, publicly confessing her complicity in the cover-up in a desperate bid for a plea deal. Watching them disintegrate was a fascinating study in the illusion of power of an empty wallet. High-status narcissists like Richard and Clara derive their entire psychological structure from their unearned wealth. Their arrogance is not rooted in genuine confidence, but in the belief that their money makes them untouchable. They view their bank accounts as a shield against morality. But when you sever the financial cord, the cognitive dissonance is immediate and catastrophic. Without their corporate status to hide behind, they didn't just lose a legal battle. They experienced a total psychological collapse. Stripped of their stolen funds, they were reduced to exactly what they had always been: pathetic, cowardly frauds who couldn't survive a single day in the real world without exploiting someone else. Following their swift convictions in federal court, the state probate judge was equally merciless. She declared the fraudulent will completely invalid and fully restored Eleanor's original estate documents. She ordered full, immediate restitution of the $1,800,000 plus decades of compound interest. As the bailiffs moved in to escort Richard and Clara away, Clara turned to me, her eyes red and wide with panic. "Audrey, please," she begged, her voice a pathetic whisper. "We're losing everything. We're your parents. You have to stop this." I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply adjusted the strap of my bag and met her desperate gaze with total indifference. "You lost everything the day you decided my life was a bank account," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I'm just closing the ledger." I turned my back on them and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to the justice they had spent 22 years earning. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed behind me with a satisfying final thud. Outside, the sunlight felt intensely bright. There were no reporters shouting questions, no dramatic media circus, just the quiet realization that the war was over. I had systematically dismantled the people who had tried to erase me, and I had done it without compromising a single ounce of my own integrity. They would spend the rest of their lives in prison and poverty, haunted by the ghost of the daughter they had tried to bury. Months later, Birchwood Hollow was unrecognizable. The rotting timber and sagging porches had been entirely replaced with sturdy, hand-hewn beams and expansive, sunlit glass. Caleb and his crew had resurrected the estate's historical beauty, transforming the derelict foundation into a breathtaking sanctuary in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Julie and Thorne had moved into the renovated guest suite, allowing us to slowly rebuild the generational bond that Richard and Clara had stolen from us decades ago. For the first time in my life, I wasn't an outsider sitting on the periphery of someone else's life. I was home, grounded in a space that belonged entirely to me. Together, Julian and I utilized the recovered trust funds to establish the Eleanor Reynolds Community Foundation. We built a dedicated center on the lower acreage of the estate, designed specifically to offer free forensic legal aid and comprehensive emotional counseling for individuals trapped in toxic, financially abusive family structures. The foundation became a beacon for people who had been marginalized, gaslit, and exploited by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The rooms were filled with sunlight and the quiet, steady hum of people finally finding their voices. This act of creation was the ultimate realization of the justice of the sower. It is a profound philosophical truth that the most devastating revenge against a destroyer is to become a creator. True justice isn't merely about punishing the guilty. It is about taking the barren, salted earth they left behind and cultivating an orchard. By turning my stolen inheritance into a fortress for the vulnerable, I ensured that Richard and Clara's greed was ultimately repurposed into a mechanism for healing. Their legacy of exploitation was completely overwritten by Eleanor's legacy of empowerment. They became nothing more than the fertilizer for my foundation. Every time a new person walks through the doors of the community center, seeking refuge from the exact kind of normalized cruelty I endured, I know that Eleanor's ultimate design has been fulfilled. The wealth that was meant to crush my spirit is now actively dismantling the systems of abuse that narcissists rely on to maintain their control. I've come to realize that survival isn't just about escaping the fire. It's about what you choose to build from the ashes. Society demands loyalty to blood, even when that blood acts as a predator. But blood is just biology. Family is an action. It is the people who stand beside you in the brutal light of truth, the ones who never ask you to shrink yourself. Forgiveness isn't always a reunion. Sometimes it is simply absolute peaceful detachment. I forgave myself for believing their lies, and then I locked the door behind them forever. The silence they left in their wake wasn't a void. It was the canvas upon which I could finally draw my own boundaries. The echoes of Birchwood Hollow no longer whisper of hidden betrayals or corporate greed. They resonate with purpose, resilience, and the undeniable power of radical independence. Standing on the newly rebuilt front porch, feeling the cool mountain mist settle over the valley, I trace the engraving on Eleanor's vintage pocket watch. It ticks steadily, a constant reminder that time only belongs to those brave enough to claim it. I am no longer the silent girl clearing plates at a glass table. I am the architect of my own life, and the foundation I have built is finally strong enough to hold me. If this story resonated with your own journey of finding strength, hit the subscribe button. Drop a comment below about what boundaries you're setting in your own life, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.